skip over a few things, but just real quick, West Nile virus, originally discovered in Africa during a yellow fever outbreak. Thank you. During a yellow fever outbreak in 1937, a woman had what they thought maybe it was yellow fever. They sent it off. It didn't come back positive. Eventually determined to have a different virus. She was from the West Nile district in Uganda. In the 50s, you have several outbreaks in Egypt and in Israel. A serial surveillance survey was done in Cairo in the 50s, and what they noticed was the older you were, the increasing likelihood that you had been exposed to West Nile virus. And so what came out in that time frame was it looked like it was a childhood disease. You got it younger, you didn't notice it, you were asymptomatic. And then later in Israel, there was an outbreak among the elderly, and it was the first example of a meningoencephalitis outbreak. It was very serious. And it was really the first indication older people were more likely to have a serious manifestation of the disease. You've already seen this picture. I'm not going to go into it, but the cycle is much more complicated than mosquitoes giving it to birds, birds giving it to mosquitoes. Birds can give it to other birds. Birds that eat carrion can get it that way, and it can be maintained in their population that way. And then the mosquitoes act as an amplifier, and then we're obviously incidental hosts. There may be other animals, certainly frogs, possibly American alligator, that has enough of a viremia to support transmission to mosquitoes as well. This is a map from 1999 of Europe. The round circles are vertebrate or human cases. The square are confirmed human cases. The hatched areas are confirmed mosquito pools for West Nile virus. And what it showed at the time was that West Nile virus could exist in temperate zones. Okay? During this time frame when outbreaks were occurring, you didn't see a whole lot of human deaths and serious illness, but you did see serious animal illness. Okay? Well, Dr. McAllister talked about the NGS maps. We're going to show just a few real quick. When it first came to the United States, it decimated some of the American birds, particularly the crows, the blue jays, the corvids. That was the first indication New World birds would be killed off as a result. The virus that came to the United States appears to be the same one that was circulating for 2 years before in Israel. And that virus had a higher incidence of meningoencephalitis than the one that I showed you earlier on the map in Europe. Okay? That's the virus we ended up with. So it starts off in 1999, 1998, it was just a few counties in the Northeast. This is 2002, you can see where it spread. 2003, now we're going across the country, and by 2005 it's all the way across. The United States, during this time frame, this is the world's largest outbreak of West Nile virus that's ever occurred. Okay? We own that. And so in 2012, we had it again, a little over 5,000 cases in the U.S. Over a third of them were here in Texas, and Dallas-Fort Worth, our area, was the epicenter. Just real quick, when does West Nile, I think you all know this, when does it occur? This is the Tarrant County data from 2012. We had 280 cases. That doesn't compare to what Dallas County had, but it was enough. The blue bars are West Nile fevers, what we call just West Nile disease now. The red bars are neuroinvasive disease, encephalitis or meningitis. And when people are talking about their brains and disabilities, it gets very upset, very concerned, because this disease, if you get a neuroinvasive form of it, can last the rest of your life. What we're showing here by onset week, and this occurs every time we have increased cases, it tends to occur in July, peaks late July, first part of August, and gradually goes back down. The West Nile virus itself, you've already heard, it's a flavivirus. That means yellow virus. Yellow fever is the prototypical virus for it. Not going to go into anything else. You can also get it through organ transplant, blood transfusion. It can go mother to child. And even in some cases, people think breastfeeding. In 2012, in Tarrant County, this is how it kind of broke down. Slightly more males than females got sick. In a race ethnicity, and the way I have it checked here or out, is it shows it by the common vernacular. So when we classify things by the census, we have white, Hispanic, black. You've got race and you have ethnicity. This is just race are white, non-Hispanic. They're black, non-Hispanic. Hispanics are grouped together. In our county, we had 82% of the cases were white. And I can tell you, white, non-Hispanic, that is not the way our population is represented. Why would white non-Hispanics have more disease than, say, Hispanics, which is a huge part of our population? Variety of, be a great reason to know. We can speculate. This is one here. This is a two-dimensional density map of the cases that occurred in 2012. So you can see they were clustered. The biggest cluster was in the mid-cities area, Hearst, Euless, Bedford. You had another little cluster down in Arlington, and then somewhat over in Fort Worth. We got a little bit more of the white population and older in the mid-cities. When we'll be looking at other data, and I won't be showing it here, year after year, and it seems like we tend to get a cluster in the HEB area. It's probably due to habitat, due to land use. The other thing is, the older you are, the more likely you are to get disease, right? Now, why is it important that Culex, the mosquitoes worry about for West Nile, and then as it turns out Aedes, love to bite at dusk and dawn? Because any disease, there's an interaction between the environment and the behavior of people who get sick. And in Texas, in North Texas, when do you want to get outside and do anything? Morning or late evening, okay? And so, and if you're older and you're retired and you're out in your Bermuda shorts and dark socks, you're exposed, right? You're going to do it at dusk or you're going to do it at dawn. All right. That's just a little bit about behavior. I was going to go into that, but that determines who gets disease. Signs and symptoms, I think you know them. For the milder form of the disease, a lot of people will be asymptomatic. I will tell you, the 80% don't get sick thing is not a great statistic. If you have a community, like I mentioned in Israel, where they were, there was like over 50% of the community got sick, they were elderly, okay? The older the population, more people get sick. If you have a population that's vulnerable because they're immunosuppressed, they'll get sick. The 80% thing comes from a community that was studied with a certain population structure. So if you have an older group, you may have more than 80% who actually get sick. If they're all young and college age, you may not have 80% asymptomatic. You may have 95% asymptomatic. Does that make sense? The rest of it, you don't need to worry about. So that's a little bit about West Nile. There was a question earlier about, hey, we seemed like we had a lot more mosquito-positive pools and we had fewer human cases. That was from over here, right? What county are you in? Okay, that's great. Beg your pardon? Well, okay, HEB area. So here's the deal. The first thing I would think of, say in 2012 when we had that big peak, about 650 samples countywide were taken. After the big peak, it got funded, and Dr. Nielsen here, I'm sitting next to, gets to do all these samples. The next year, 2013, over 4,500 samples are taken. All right, so we're what, 7 times more? And then again last year. So the actual numbers of positive mosquito pools are just a function of more tests being done. So Nina, who you probably know, is sitting right next to him, is doing this vector index now, actually takes into account that, and that will be the thing to watch. There are other reasons that you could have positive mosquito pools and no human cases. And that'd be, if you were around where crows are, and they tend to live in rural areas, you don't have as many people to be incidental hosts, right? And there you could actually be testing, you get positive mosquito pools, you get a lot, but not a lot of people sick. So there's other reasons as well. But I think that's probably the operative thing here that you saw. That was a good question. All right, dengue fever, another flavivirus. This is interesting. Dengue was the second known disease to be caused by a virus in 1907. The first one was yellow fever, kind of its first cousin. Traditionally, 4 distinct antigenic types. Someone mentioned earlier there is a 5th one that was announced in 2013. The reason that's important in dengue, if you get infected with one serotype, you are now immune to that serotype, but you can still be infected by the others. And if you are infected by the others, you have an increased risk of having serious illness. shock syndrome, or hemorrhagic fever. So that's a real implication for vaccine makers. If they make a vaccine, it's got to protect against all of them very well. Because if it doesn't protect against one, it can make the situation worse. Okay? Another thing about the serotypes in the Americas, all 4 circulate, although only 3 usually circulate in Mexico. Considered to be the most common arthropod-borne disease in the world. I believe it's, 2.5 billion people live in endemic areas with dengue fever. The classification system has changed since 2009 was a big change for classifying it. You have a dengue-like illness, usually in an endemic area. Someone has a fever, looks like dengue, they call it dengue. Then you can have dengue fever itself, nausea, vomiting, rash, aches. And I've got the things listed here in bold. They're called warning signs. If a person has persistent vomiting or abdominal pain or swelling, if their hematocrit goes up, which means they're probably losing fluid in the body, and the blood cells don't have as much fluid to be in, so the hematocrit goes up, they're going to go into shock. And if they do that, that's severe dengue or hemorrhagic fever. Most people, the way this goes, this is from CDC, after 3 to 4 days after being bitten, they usually come down with an abrupt fever. It can last 2 to 7 days. It can be biphasic. You get a high fever at the first, you get a high fever at the end. Sometimes after a couple of days, the fever breaks. Or maybe up to 7 days, the fever breaks. That's when the danger point occurs. Okay? Most of the time we think, hey, fever's good, we're good. Most people will tend to get better, but during the next 24 to 48 hours, there is fluid leakage in the body. And if the body's willing to handle it and reabsorbs it during that time, the person gets better. But they could be tipped over, and then they go into, really going into shock. The body starts to maintain the blood pressure and the pulse, and the person is lucid, they can talk, and then all of a sudden they crash. Okay? And that's dengue shock syndrome. That's if that happens. So dengue doesn't necessarily kill everybody, but it can disable the number of years lost of life, plus the disability after having the disease, so the person doesn't have a full life, if you will, is very significant. You've seen this slide earlier from World Health Organization, the places are at risk because of the distribution of the vector. I want to talk about dengue just real quick. There have been large outbreaks in the northern Mexico. It's cyclical every 3 to 5 years. And so a couple years ago, Tamaulipas, one right across from the state across from Brownsville and McAllen, large numbers of cases. They'll have thousands of cases in those 2 big cities. And yet, on our side, we'll have 24 or 26. In the period between 2002 to 2012, there were like 5 cases in Texas that were endemic, transmitted here. 4 in Cameron County, 1 in Hidalgo. That's Brownsville and McAllen. So why do we have all those cases along the border? Anyone here from South Texas? I'm from Michigan. And so, that river's not big, nor is it deep. Why do we not have cases in the U.S. like that? And that's where people postulate we have window screens. And going over Matamoros and Reynosa, it is different. Air conditioning is not as prevalent, window screens, but I can tell you on our side, we have a lot of communities, colonias, that don't have air conditioning and don't have screens. So it's a question, why don't we have it? Seroprevalence surveys done have found folks that, hey, they were positive, apparently they weren't symptomatic, and over 70% of people infected with dengue may not come up with symptoms. So we may have had transmission along the border that's unrecognized. A paper put out, was it last year or year before, a little controversial, out of Houston, Dr. McMurray. Anyways, they went back and looked at banked blood from Houston in 2002, 3, 4, and 5. And they found evidence of an outbreak in Houston that occurred in 2003, more cases in 4, and it petered out in 2005. Never recognized. Why? to recognize an outbreak, someone has to diagnose it. And our medical community is not looking for it. Okay? So it could have happened, and Houston has Egypti all the time. Okay? And so it could have been happening in Texas, maybe small, but it could be happening here in parts of our state we didn't know. All right, so enough of that on dengue. Chick V. And as far as that, you saw in Dr. McAllister's slide, I had it written down. You know, I think last year the 4 counties, Denton had one, Collin had one, Dallas had one, we had 2. They were all imported cases. We have not detected an endemically transmitted case in our county. Now, I used to be in Central Texas, and it's just a few years ago, and doesn't show up in the statistics. An Austin woman died of dengue and never went out of the country. Okay, went to another state and back, but it looked like got it in Texas. We're just not sure where. All right, Chick V. This is an alpha virus. You've already heard that. First described in the 50s in Africa. When it changed and it emerged in East Africa and then went to La Reunion, which is a big island there on the East Coast, huge outbreak. We tend to think of big rates of 100 cases per 100,000 population. They had rates of 75,000 per 100,000 population. 75% of the population infected, and most of them will have symptoms. Since the introduction of Chick V in 2013, October 2013, there's been over 1.2 million cases in the Americas. That's as of last week from PAHO. There have been local transmitted cases now in Mexico, and the list that Dr. Florian showed, those are in central, southern Mexico. The states in northern Mexico that border us have not yet reported, but we're wondering, will it follow dengue? Will it get to the border and then we won't see a lot? Okay. The cases we've had in Texas have all been imported. So they've gone, the ones that I've seen, they've gone to the Virgin Islands, they've gone to the Dominican Republic, Puerto Rico. They've gone there and they've come back with it. Now, our thinking was, hey, if they can travel there, whether it be home or to see folks or just to visit and come back, they probably have a living arrangement here that's fairly decent. And so they're sick, they're staying in their home, and hopefully don't get bit. We have had reported suspected cases that are still viremic. Okay? So we don't know that they are for sure as Chick V, but they're in the right place. They have this awful joint problem, and they had high fever. Okay? When that happens, we notify in our county, we notify environmental health, and we also ask the patient, we'd like to send someone out to look at your house. We want to look at the screens, look at the mosquitoes. And so we let Nina and her group know maybe an issue. We've had several cases of people reported after their viremic, which Dr. Florian talked about. One lady in particular went home, take care of her mother, who had chikungunya. Came back, first day back, got sick. Never went to the doctor. 4 weeks later, still had the arthritis, went then. And then a week or 2 after that, we got it reported. Okay? So that was a missed opportunity. And that will happen. Now, the last thing I just want to let's talk about fever and joint pain is a big thing. This is a slide that Dr. McAllister had earlier. I kept looking at everyone's slides when I got that. Chikungunya and dengue can present similarly, and they circulate together in the Americas. And so you got to be careful as you're a clinician. You don't give the wrong thing because you can make dengue worse. So you got all this pain. You don't want to give something that will prevent coagulation. Okay? Joint pain can occur in both, but the swelling of the joints is a real big thing for chikungunya. And you'll see in the literature, and you'll see on CDC website, most people get over it in a couple of weeks. When you look at the papers from Europe, where it occurred there in Italy, we're talking half of the people still have problems 2 years later. Okay? Severe arthritis. So it's not something to... Okay. So these are the cases where cases occurred. The whole United States is included because Florida had some locally transmitted cases last year. But they're the only ones in our country, in the continental U.S. Puerto Rico's endemic now. I mean, they had lots of number of cases. U.S. Virgin Islands. Okay, so I want to leave you all with another thought. When we have West Nile, and I showed you that plate, that map showing where they kind of cluster, you'll get a case one place, and then 5 miles later you get another case, and maybe a whole different city you get a case. That's a result of this cycle going on in the wildlife and the mosquito thing going on there. We're just accidental hosts. Dengue and chikungunya are different, and they express themselves spatially different. So in dengue and in chikungunya, the person with the highest risk of getting chikungunya is someone who lives with someone with chikungunya or lives with someone with dengue. So if a person comes in with those diseases, the person most likely to be infected next is in that household. The second one is their neighbor. Okay? So with West Nile, you got all these things popping up. With this disease, these diseases, it tends to be in a neighborhood. And that's why CDC talks about going out 50 meters. You've got that mosquito likes to stay around, feed on the people it knows. Okay? And so it goes house to house. For a response to chikungunya, the idea is to prevent it there, you may have to go out and find other cases. So, yes, we kind of expect to find someone who tells us it looks like they got chikungunya, they've got all the right signs and symptoms, and they never traveled. Then the next thing is, where did they get it from? Because it'll probably be in a close area. Who else is going to get it? All right.